you can start now. Hello, Antonis. It's a great honor to have you here with us. My name is Thiago, and we together are the Classics Reading Club, ADT. We join together every week, every Friday, to talk and to read and discuss different pieces of literature from the Greek or Roman times. And it's always a great pleasure to receive specialists in the area to enlighten us a little bit on the subject, to talk about the themes. And today we have Antonis Petrides, a great honor to have it with us. If you want to present yourself, Professor.
Well, it's my honor to be with you too. It's always been my dream to visit Brazil. I guess that's one way to do it. My name is Antonis Petrides. I'm a classicist, a native of Cyprus. I've worked on Menander for the greater part of my life now, and I'm not a young man anymore. So that at least says something about enjoyment and the enjoyment I take in this author. I will share my presentation now. I have a largish PDF. I hope you will bear with me for a relatively long presentation, which I hope you will find interesting. I don't know if you can see my PDF. The title of my talk, The Evolution of Comedy from Aristophanes to Menander. Can you all see it? Can you all see the presentation? I guess you can. Excellent. Perfect. Okay. So I'm starting right away, so not to waste time. So 100 years is the time distance between Aristophanes and Menander. What you see in your screen right now are synopses of Aristophanes' Acharnians, which was staged in 425 BC, and Menander's Dyskolos, staged in 317 BC. As you can see, these are two very different plays. Acharnians is a political and topical play, very fantastical in its plot, utopian in its ending, whereas Menander's Dyskolos, which I'm hearing you have read in your reading club recently, is quite a different story. It's apart from the intervention by the god Pan in the beginning of the play, everything else that takes place on stage is pretty much realistic in its outlook. The development of the plot pivots on the actions, characters and moral choices, and it unfolds in a way that's easily explainable by means of human psychology and logic. So what happens? Why did comedy change so much in these 100 years? How did that change come to be? And that change was unique to comedy, because as far as we know, tragedy did not change as much in the same period of time. Why are the following elements almost entirely gone from the comedy of Menander? The so-called onomasti komodin, that was personal attacks against individuals, obscenity and sexual licentiousness, topical matters and overt tackling of major public issues concerning the polis, such as war, politics, philosophy and letters, plots with strong fairy tale elements and a non-linear episodic structure, fundamental elements of old comedy plots such as the epigrammatic agon and the parabasis. All these elements are entirely or almost entirely gone from the comedy of Menander. And as if the previous weren't enough, Menander's comedy also lacks Aristophanes' linguistic polyedeia, this comical mixture of motley linguistic elements. It also lacks Aristophanes' polymetry and the central significance of music and the chorus. It lacks old comedy's grotesque characters, which are entirely unrealistic or anti-realistic in their outlook and psychology, with their hanging phalluses and their overcharged and overly stressed carnal dimension. Menander's comedy lacks old comedy's splashy, spectacular costumes dressing all sorts of creatures, human or non-human, of course with the analogous masks. What you see in this slide are some scenes inspired by old comedy plays as depicted on vases, mainly from South Italy. And what you see here are depictions of new comedy characters. You can see the difference, it's obvious. Here are some comedy masks, some new comedy masks. On the left, it's the poet Menander himself examining the mask in the course of designing a plot. So, what kind of road led from old comedy to new? And why were so many changes in effect in these 100 years? Before trying to answer these questions, let us first codify the changes in the comic modes of Aristophanes and Menander, respectively. Let's start with plot and narrative. Old comedy presented a great range of plots, plays that dealt with topical matters of contemporary politics, fantastical stories of escape to magical lands or of alternative topsy-turvy worlds, mythological parodies, stories involving historical personages, big shots of the day, in association with the lives and troubles of everyday citizens, etc. These categories of plots often cross-pollinated, producing imaginative combinations of rich and colorful variety. On the contrary, the plots of new comedy are based on a typical romantic story in a rather limited number of variations. Boy loves girl, overcomes societal obstacles with the help of his friends and or of luck, marries the girl. This new comedy plot pattern, of course, is not as shallow as it looks at first sight. It has ideological consequences, touching on issues central to the identity of a polites, citizen of a polis, that is, an independent city-state. These issues are gender, status, class, legitimacy, etc. Oftentimes, also, new comedy plots are the urban reflections of known mythical narratives as dramatized in tragedy or not necessarily with a parodic intent. Old comedy plots are not bound by verisimilitude on any level. On the contrary, new comedy plots adopt the narrative modes of tragedy, especially Euripidean tragedy. This is the unity of time, place, and plot, using messenger speeches or omniscient prologues for reporting events that happened off stage or in the prehistory of the plot, sequencing the events in a logical and linear fashion, pivoting on psychologically cogent moral choices made by the characters, structuring the plot on the axis of peripeteia, that is, abrupt reversal from better to worse or the opposite, and anagnorisis, recognition of characters or realities. And finally, observing more or less the dramatic illusion, including what would come to be known as the fourth wall. In terms of characters, these two genres also differ quite a lot. New comedy does not share the exuberant, unreal variety of old comedy prosopography. One could see all kinds of creatures parading on the old comedy stage. Fictional characters as much as historical personages. Heroes of myth and everyday people, or everyday people masquerading as heroes of myth. Greeks and barbarians, gods and mortals, humans and animals, or zoomorphic humans, such as the figure that you see on this vase on the right, or anthropomorphic animals. Abstract notions, even the letters of the Greek alphabet or the dimps of Athens or the clouds of the sky could be characters of old comedy. Per contra, new comedy characters are recognizable moral types, such as one would encounter on the street or as outlined in Theophrastus's seminal work called Characters. Theophrastus, by the way, was a peripatetic philosopher, the successor of Aristophanes, of Aristotle in the school of the Peripatos, and reportedly Menander's teacher. He was certainly Menander's contemporary. New comedy preserves the basic lineup of characters developed in the decades before Menander. We'll talk a lot about these characters later. But above all, new comedy characters reflect the strict stratification of a society which is couched as a scala naturae, as a natural hierarchization of humanity according to gender, age, social status, or class, as described again by Aristotle. You will find that Aristotle and his pupils are quite significant for understanding and for contextualizing Menander and new comedy. Characters, still. The ancient Greek term character, as used predominantly in peripatetic philosophy, does not correspond to the modern psychological notion of character. It refers to the general ethical traits of a person, the imprint of nature on his ethos. The Greek term character literally means imprint. Ethos, in its turn, is a term pointing to a person's innate tendency towards virtue or vice. From the previous does not follow that for the Greeks a person's behavior is predetermined. We are talking about the imprint of nature, we're talking about innate tendency towards virtue or vice, but this does not mean that a person's behavior is predetermined. According to Aristotle, a person becomes a moral subject in action, that is, by making moral choices in real situations. This is what Aristotle calls prohairesis, literally choosing one course of action over another. Prohairesis produces a kind of habitus, ekexis in man. In other words, if a person is exercised in making virtuous choices, the person grows to be virtuous. Menander's characters are shown to be making moral choices, virtuous choices, or the contrary, thus becoming moral subjects in action. Another interesting fact about new comedy characters that is quite different from old comedy is that new comedy tends to focus on human types who, again, still, according to Aristotle, are either immature moral subjects, for instance, neaniskoi, young men, or people whose proeretic faculties are in decline, namely old men. You can understand, I guess, what's going on here. Theatre feeds on conflict, and the dramatic possibilities fostered by the presence on stage of such moral subjects as are likely to produce various kinds of crises with their immature or declined proeretic choices are evident. New comedy fathers, which are really old men, are usually blocking characters, and in the end of the play they are put in their place. Young men make mistakes, sometimes grave ones, such as raping a girl or becoming enamored with women not eligible for marriage at first sight, prostitutes, foreigners, and the like. The plot resolves these conflicts at the end, and the young men become married men. In New Comedy, the promise of marriage at the end of the play corresponds with the moment that an eaniskos, an immature moral subject, in the beginning becomes a fully fledged adult. Let's see now differences between new and old comedy in terms of structure. In terms of structure, new comedy plots are continuous dramatic narratives unfolding in logical sequence and divided into 5 parts, or 5 acts as we know them. In some cases, an expository prologue is attached to the first act. This means that new comedy abandons the episodic construction of old comedy. The epireumatic agon and the paravasis, which were the centerpieces of Aristophanes' comedy, are gone, whereas the chorus, which also played a pivotal part in structuring an old comedy play, is reduced by Menander's time to a very marginal role. Choral songs exist in new comedy. The chorus does not disappear in Menander's play, but choral songs are inserted between acts as music and dance interludes, and their text, probably not even composed by the playwright himself, is not included in the play scripts. In lieu of the choral song, the manuscripts, such as the one you see on your screen, only present the indication chorou, part of the chorus. This phenomenon is not new with Menander. It had appeared already in the manuscript tradition of the 2 latest among Aristophanes' surviving plays, Ecclesiazuse and Plutus. The choruses of new comedy, I repeat, are there. They make noise, but they never become integral parts of the dramatic world. They comprise a group of extraneous revelers, komastai, that barge in the play's world at regular intervals at the end of each act, but they are only acknowledged once in the play at the end of the first act. The 5 mere parts or acts of new comedy correspond to the roughly 5 episodia comprising the average tragic play. Tragic episodia were also divided by choral songs, stasima. Remember this because the importance of tragedy and tragic intertextuality and osmosis with tragedy is cardinal for understanding the nature of new comedy and many of its differences from Aristophanes' type of comic genre. The general plot pattern of a new comedy play is the following. Act 1 presents the comic situation and introduces the main characters. Act 2 to 4 unfold the conflicts and the moral conundrums of the play, what the great Menandrist Alain Blanchard termed thème romanesque and thème moral. And the fifth and final act, after a brief reversal at the beginning of the act that presents a fresh complication, which is resolved very quickly, however, brings about the eventual happy ending, which materializes in general reconciliation and a marriage, or oftentimes marriages, plural. I skip over some details to talk about the differences between Menander and Aristophanes in terms of language and style. Aristophanes' language, and that's observable even in translation sometimes. Aristophanes' language was as colorful and strategically inhomogeneous as his overall comic world, a panspermia of linguistic levels, styles, dialects, idiolects, tropes, imagery, intertextual references, and all kinds of other humorous applications of language, from its most mundane to its most literary variations. New comedy, on the other hand, develops a decidedly consistent and realistic dramatic language that seems accurately to reflect the tongue of everyday late 4th century BC bourgeois populations, with elements that prefigure the emergence of the so-called Hellenistic koine, the common Greek language of the Hellenistic period. Menander especially used style also for dramaturgical reasons, namely to individualize the otherwise stereotypical characters of his genre. Menander takes characters that are stereotypes and makes them individuals, and he does that largely by way of giving each character his own linguistic style. Aristophanes did not present any aspirations of linguistic realism. His characters did not speak as individual people. They spoke like books, they spoke like princes or tragic kings at one moment, and people working in the agora, in the marketplace, in the other. They had no homogeneity in the way they spoke. They had no consistency in the way they spoke. Menander's characters speak like real people, and they speak like individual people. What happens to the lyrical parts in Menander's comedy? Apart from the choral interludes mentioned above, which, I repeat, were not part of the dramatic world, they were an extraneous part of the play, lyrical parts in Menander are not absent, but they are very rare. We have very few examples from surviving fragments of New Comedy, which are not spoken dialogue, but they are pieces of song. Metrically speaking, having reduced the lyrical element to a bare minimum, New Comedy, by necessity, limits itself also to a small number of meters that reflects, again, the natural, realistic rhythms of everyday speech, mostly the so-called iambic trimeter and the trochaic tetrameter. There are also scenes in iambic tetrameter. All three of these meters were used in the discourse that you read. Let's move now to differences in performance, in actually producing the dramatic text on stage. starting with the handling of space and time. So, on the level of performance too, new comedy differs from old comedy in so much as it imitates, realistically for the most part, the everyday life of citizens using the analogous costumes, masks, and props. In terms of space and time, old comedy may represent literally any space, real and realistic, or entirely fantastical. More importantly, old comedy space is fluid, likely to metamorphose into anything at any time. One moment, Aristophanes' characters traverse the land of Attica, and the next, they are in Nephelokokkigia, their new colony in the sky. Narrative time in Aristophanes could not but be just as malleable. Old comedy entertains no pretensions of realism, I repeat for perhaps the 10th time today. Conversely, time and space in new comedy are configured according to the practices of tragedy. Only instead of the mythical epic environments of that genre, new comedy depicts life in the contemporary polis. Space and time in new comedy, just as they were in tragedy, are unified, with sporadic exceptions. The new comedy stage usually features two houses, normally in some deme of Attica or in other Greek cities. In between these two houses lies a public space, for instance, a sanctuary, as in the Dyskolos, represented by the central skene door. Skene is the stage building. This central door is significantly larger than the other two flanking it. In some plays, the central door is semiotically inert. It does not represent anything but an intermediate space where the two houses converge in reconciliation and unity at the end. Costumes. Old comedy costumes too, like old comedy characters, are more diverse than those of new comedy in accordance with the almost indefinite variety of its characters. New comedy, on its part, apart from the prologues, who can be deities or abstractions, presents ordinary civilians, naturally dressed in the common attire of the times. Apart from the variety mentioned above, old comedy costumes are also distinguished by their so-called somadion. This is a kind of fat suit which the actors wore underneath their garments to puff their bellies, buttocks, and thighs. And these somadion also presented, in terms of male characters, of course, a hanging leather phallus. This phallus was exposed under the short tunic of the characters, or it could also be wrapped, and obviously it fed various jokes. New comedy retains, in some cases, the somadion, but the phallus is gone. Characters look their real-life counterparts, and no man in Menander's time walked the streets with his phallus hanging out. So, a realistic costume. Although, if we believe Julius Pollux, this is a writer, an author that penned an encyclopedic dictionary in the 2nd century AD. So if we believe this man, some Menandrian character types, like the young man, the parasite, the soldier, and others, may have had their own dress code. So there may have been some kind of deviation from the realistic norm in terms of some genera of characters. The masks of old comedy like the costumes and like the characters themselves, were by and large unique specimens as per the nature of each character. By the time of Menander, however, the comic mask system becomes standardized, divided into 4 genera, general categories, according to age and social status. These categories were the following 4. Papoi, that is old men over 60, mostly fathers, who are to become grandfathers in the course of many a new comedy play. Neaniskoi, that is young men on the cusp of biological and social adulthood or slightly older. Douloi, male slaves including parasites and cooks. And Eunyges, women, free and slave, married and unmarried, young and old, hetairae, that's courtesans, and palakai, concubine. The genus of women, you understand, included categories of masks from all 3 male genera. Finally, the last difference between old and new comedy regards the number of speaking actors that are needed for staging a performance. All of Menander's plays can be performed with 3 actors only. Au contraire, the so-called parachori gemata, extra personnel, are much more often in Aristophanes, where scenes demanding 4 or 5 actors are not uncommon. So, what happened? ¿Qué pasó? Why did the comic genre change so much between Aristophanes' and Menander's first surviving plays? That is the Acharnians and the Dyskolos. Did Menander just decide to revolutionize the way comedy was written, or was it more of a process? What comes between Aristophanes and Menander? What comes between them is a period of about 60 years between the death of Aristophanes and the first performance of Menander, in which the comic genre gradually formulates the features that Menander and his contemporaries inherited and perfected. This period of time, conventionally dated from 400 to 322 BC, or from 385 roughly to 322 BC, is named Middle Comedy. So between Aristophanes' Old Comedy and Menander's New Comedy comes Middle Comedy. What is this Middle Comedy? This is a period in which the context and the political economy of theatrical performances is transformed, completely transformed. This factor, the political economy and the context of theatrical performances, above any other, seems to have brought about the shifts in dramaturgy that I described before, especially as regards the types of comic plot that prevail in the time between Aristophanes and Menander. Eventually, the different plot requirements necessitate changes in the performance medium too. These are the 3 major sets of changes that happen in the period of Middle Comedy, and it is on these sets of changes that I will expound in the remaining 20 minutes of my talk. Let's begin by the most important. The performance context shifts. Over the course of the 4th century BC, theatre becomes a pan-Hellenic industry, and drama is the prime cultural export of Athens. This is a great major developments. The theatre market becomes globalized. New theatre buildings and festivals, including theatrical performances, crop up in the four corners of the Greek-speaking world. Poets and actors from other cities settle in Athens to do theatre, but they also tour everywhere, presenting tragic and comic plays in premiere or in reperformance. These actors are now recognized as professional technitai, artists whose power, prestige, renown, and wealth exceeds those of the poets, if we believe Aristotle. The numerous new opportunities for mounting performances, as well as the more formulaic character of the comic plots in this period of time, causes a radical increase in the output of dramas per poet by the middle of the 4th century. You can see a table on your left with major comic poets from each stage in the evolution of the comic genre and their respective output. It is true that in some cases the sources may count the alternative title of a play used in a reperformance as a new comic drama, but still the numbers are stark. 44 comedies by Aristophanes, 245 and 260 by Alexis and Antiphanes, and 108 by Menander. As you can see, there is a peak of dramatic productivity by the middle of the 4th century, and the numbers are later normalized to circa 100 plays per poet by the end of the 4th century. It is obvious that the financial incentive of productivity was significant. I insist on the financial and the market factor because theatre is not just an art, but it is an industry, and it is at this exact period of time that theatre becomes business. It becomes show business. But the dramaturgy evolves as well in the period of Middle Comedy. In this period of time, two types of comic plot are predominant. Mythological parody that prevails in the first half of the 4th century BC, and a so-called urban comedy that comes to the foreground from 350 BC onwards. Now, none of these two types is strictly new. Both were attested already in the 5th century. The general impression that we have that old comedy is synonymous with the topical political comedy that was trendy during the so-called Archidamian War, 431-421, that was the first phase of the Peloponnesian conflict, in which 5 out of 11 of Aristophanes' extant plays date, is fallacious. Old comedy, even Aristophanes', was much more diverse than that. All three of these comic plot types, political comedy, mythological parody, urban comedy, were present by the time of Aristophanes. They were even practiced by Aristophanes himself. In the 4th century, political comedy subsides, and the other two types take center stage, until, by the time of Menander, mythological comedy gives way too. Let's see these two plot types prevailing in Middle Comedy in more detail. Starting with mythological parody. The comic subgenre of mythological parody debunks and ridicules traditional myths, and in some cases their depiction in tragedy. Myths and tragic plots are debunked mostly in the following two ways. The first is what I call the heroes like common folk model. In this model, the great heroes of myth coexist on stage with everyday types of 4th century urban life. Here you can see the great Aegisthus, the killer of Agamemnon, conversing with a common slave, and two choregoi, liturgies that shouldered the expenses of comic or tragic performances. So this hero of the tragic and epic past thinks and behaves like the common folk of the day. That is, he behaves badly, descending from the pedestal of his heroic superiority. That was the first model, the heroes like common folk model. The second model was the reverse, the common folk like heroes model. According to this, little people are shown to speak and act like the heroes of myth, and their adventures are often the comic reflection of tragic plots. Here you see a scene of mythological parody in which the centaur Chiron is the main character. Chiron is not literally a centaur in this play, but it is an old man pushed from behind by a slave, this figure here, in his attempt to climb up a flight of stairs. Mythological parody is very important for the history of the comic genre, because mythological parody seems to have been the prime channel through which the comic genre appropriates those conventions of tragedy that become so central to new comedy. Here you can see a nice modern example of mythological parody. This is Oedipus asking the Sphinx, anything decent on Netflix? And the Sphinx replying, you should check out How I Met My Mother. And this is, and on the right there's a meme, many happy returns to us, baby. Oh, leave me alone, mother. Oedipus, February 14, 428 BC. And from modern memes to ancient vases again, this is Zeus and Hermes acting as comic characters in a middle comedy play. This is Heracles at the temple of Zeus. These are all vases from South Italy, dating in the first half of the 4th century, presenting scenes from old comedy or middle comedy plays. This is Heracles and Apollo, and this is the so-called New York goose play. This is an old man with his hands tied up. This is a young man, probably a barbarian slave, talking gibberish. This is an old woman uttering some words to the old man. We do not know exactly what's going on here, but what makes this vase interesting is that beyond these normal comic characters, you have a figure on the left that is named Tragodos. So again, we have a kind of mixture of comedy and tragedy. And another comic play merging a mythological character, in this case Charis, with a common slave Xanthias and an ordinary old man named Philodimites. That was the kind of comic plot that was central, that was the most popular in comedy in the first half of the 4th century BC. From around 350 BC until the emergence of Menander, the comic plot that's more to the liking of audiences is the so-called urban comedy. This plot type presented scenes from the everyday life of ordinary citizens, Athenians or dwellers of other polis, which normally, and these plots normally circled initially around specific moral, social, or professional types. And there were various configurations of this pattern. One such configuration could be the exploitation of an ignorant and brutish peasant and an agroigos by cunning courtesans or other city characters. It could be a story about the life and times of such courtesans, who could be either vicious exploiters of agroigoi, for example, or, on the contrary, gentle souls suffering in the hands of their procurers. A type of urban comedy presented the disturbance caused by the appearance of a rich and powerful, puffed up yet stupid professional soldier, a miles gloriosus, or the boastful shenanigans of a cook, a mageros, who fancied himself as some sort of artist, cum scientist, cum philosopher, in the context of preparing a symposium or some other feast. It could be a comedy about the relationship between a parasite, that is a sponger or a hangeron, and his keeper, the man who provided him with luxurious sustenance in exchange of subservience and flattery. Finally, it could be a comedy about the ridiculous antics of philosophers, doctors, usually quacks, and other inflated fanfarons called in Greek alazones. If you followed the history of comedy in medieval and Renaissance times, you probably recognize these ancient types in their medieval and Renaissance counterparts. However, and this is a big however, by far the most enduring and influential subgenre of urban comic drama developed in the period of Middle Comedy was the one that pivoted on the sufferings and the frustrations of a young man in love with a girl whom he initially cannot have. These sufferings are normally caused by three situations. They could be caused by a blocking character. For instance, a father, as we mentioned above. A father who has financial or other reasons to oppose the marriage. A blocking character could also be an erotic rival, like the soldier I just mentioned, or a greedy pimp who will not give up the girl unless he receives more money. A second factor hindering the marriage could be a series of misunderstandings, happenstances, or unfortunate moral choices by the characters which caused conflict and rifts in the comic world. Finally, and more interestingly, the marriage could be blocked by lingering doubts concerning the identity of one or both the lovers, namely whether they are citizens and thus eligible to marry and produce legitimate children according to the requirements of an old law of 451 BC, the so-called law of Pericles, which, albeit Athenian and perhaps in disuse in the 4th century, is taken by comedy to be universal. These doubts, which are happily resolved by the end of the play are often due to the fact that one or both lovers, as children, had been exposed, abducted, or given up for adoption. I'm sure that you recognize again these plot patterns in many Renaissance comedies and even modern plot patterns, even seen in Hollywood movies. This type of comic plot, the romantic comedy, seems to displace all others in the period of new comedy. We cannot judge the quality of middle comedy plays because none has survived. We have mere fragments from middle comedy plays. Although poets like Antiphonus, Eubulus, and Alexis, the prime exponents of middle comedy, were highly successful and respected. What is undeniable, however, is that in the hands of masters like Menander, these quite formulaic plots that I outlined a few moments ago acquired color, intensity, and even depth, as the emphasis shifted towards sculpting interesting characters and tackling issues central to civic ideology. In Menander's hands, this plot is no longer really about boy meets girl, boy marries girl, but about the character of the boy, but about the character of the blocking character, and about the situations and the systemic issues that cause the conflicts and the rifts in the comic world. Beyond this masterful manipulation of the plot, Menander went even further. He even wove cleverly intertextual plots, conversing especially with tragedy. Menander's plays are often the reflection of dramatic situations as staged in tragedy. His characters are oftentimes, the mirrors of tragic characters. Menander's comedy is not just interesting because of his excellent characterological skills, it is also a comedy that is highly and deeply intertextual in a way that prefigures the manner of Hellenistic poetry to come a few decades afterwards. The third major shift in the period of middle comedy that is interesting to talk about are the changes that happened that affected the performance medium, namely the standardization of characters and masks. As above, I mentioned the system of new comedy masks, as described in Julius Pollux's Onomasticon. A late source, I repeat, which nonetheless squares well with the archaeological records. That system of masks was not invented out of the blue by Menander or any other new comedy playwright. That system of masks, too, was a gradual development of the long 4th century. We had, according to Pollux, we had 44 new comedy masks. Webster, a great theater historian and philologist, distinguished 43 comic mask types of middle comedy based entirely on archaeological sources. Pollux's new comedy masks already included relics of middle comedy, which Menander himself rarely uses, if at all, such as the parasite or the pimp, but they do survive all the same. Other middle comedy figures, such as the cook, retain their position in new comedy and in Menander, but their role is significantly toned down. Middle comedy masks are divided into two archaeological categories. And here you can see the same pattern dividing the period of Middle Comedy into two internal sub-periods. In the years 400 to 350 BC, the prevailing masks are different. The archaeologists called them old-style masks because they are reminiscent of the grotesque prosopoeia of old comedy. Contrarily, from around 350 BC onwards, a new style of mask prevails, and this new style of masks has more naturalistic traits and an apparent correlation with contemporary sculpture, especially the work of Lysippus, which converses with a scientific or pseudo-scientific practice on the rise since the late 5th century, and that is physiognomics. Physiognomics propounded the idea that a person's facial features and other outward traits, that is the shape of his and the length of his nose, the breadth of his forehead, even the color of his hair, and so on and so forth, were nothing less than indices of his innate propensity towards virtue or vice. And if you remember what I said in the beginning, this innate propensity towards virtue or vice was termed by Aristotle as ethos, character. So new style masks pave the way for the mask of new comedy. The archaeological record shows a predominance of old men and slaves among old-style masks. Again, old-style masks were reminiscent of the grotesque nature of old comedy characters, and the archaeological record shows that in this period of time, the more farcical characters of comic drama, old men and slaves, were more popular. As time moves on, by the mid-5th century and later, new style masks are mostly masks of young men and women. And that again is not an accident. The romantic comedy plot type centers around the married couple to be. And this is again the plot type that prevails from the middle of the century onwards. Here I will show you some middle comedy types. These types are from a set of terracotta figurines from a whole collection, a unified collection of terracotta figurines now in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. These characters these figurines present characters dating from the beginning of the 4th century. And if you remember the vases I showed you before with scenes from old comedy, you can see the likeness. These early middle comedy characters resemble the characters of Aristophanes with their bellies and their fat thighs and buttocks, and of course with their hanging or their wrapped up phalluses. This is the hungry Heracles, mythological parody, a weeping traveler, perhaps Odysseus, again in a mythological parody, a slave carrying a basket, female characters here on the left and in the center, a coquettish Hetaira, a shy young girl, a parasite here, and an androgynous character like the parasite was. A kept man was considered to be an androgynous man, and hence this obviously male character has not only a big belly but also enlarged breasts and puffy cheeks and a slightly feminine face. Old women types here, again with non-naturalistic characteristics, or with, if not exactly non-naturalistic, with an increased ugliness that reminds one of the hags in Aristophanes' Ecclesia Zeus, for example, a 4th century play dating not long after the dating of these very figurines. Slave types, the sitting slave type, the thinking slave type, and so on and so forth. And now moving on to the last part of my talk. I need another 6 to 7 minutes. What caused such radical shifts in 4th century comedy? I sort of forewarned you about the answer before. Let me begin by deconstructing the old hypothesis. The old hypothesis that the evolution of comedy was determined by some kind of force majeure. For instance, the presumed decline of the polis and democracy, or the imposition of censorship on onomastic, homodine, and obscenity. This old hypothesis obviously does not hold. And why do I say obviously? Because middle comedy, in which these traits started developing, coincided with a period in which the polis institution throughout the Greek world was still flourishing. It was not dead at all. Athenian democracy, in fact, in this period of time, in the 4th century, was solidifying its institutions. Far from being dead and buried, it was solidifying its institutions. It was not until after the Lamian War of 322 BC that Athenian political power declined, never really to recuperate, and democracy started gradually to erode away, although it was not officially abandoned, but for very brief periods of time. And even then, even after 322 and 317, more importantly, political themes and personal attacks were not uncommon in comedy. Although they are not present in Menander himself, they are not uncommon in his contemporaries. For example, the comic poet Philippides, a younger contemporary of Menander, attacked Dimitrios Poliorketes, one of the major figures of the day. Strangely enough, also, openly political plots did not disappear, but they seem to have migrated to satire play of all genres, at least temporarily, if one can judge by a play called Again, written by a playwright named Python. This play, a satire play, I repeat, not a comedy, a satire play, attacked Harpalos, Alexander's crooked treasurer. It seems that the strongest motivators for the change in comic theatre were the following two. First, a simple shift in theatrical taste over the centuries. I mentioned that the comic plots prevailing in the 4th century were not new. There were comic plot types that were already present in the 5th century. The first half of the 4th century seems to have preferred mythological plays, mythological parodies. The second half of the 4th century seems to have favorited urban comedies and romantic comedies more particularly. Theatrical taste shifts, and with it comic theatre changes. But even more important and even stronger motivator were the notorious laws of the markets. As the environment in which the theatre industry operated evolved, so did the product that industry offered. The 4th century is a period of radical change in all aspects of the Greek world, which resulted in the total transformation of the geopolitical milieu. It was only natural that theatre would accelerate its evolutionary mechanisms as well. As the market for comedy becomes global, the need to design plots that interest diverse audiences became even more pressing. Pay attention to these points. Mythological parody, satire against universal human types, and romantic comedy about a boy and a girl served that purpose perfectly because they could be understandable anywhere by anybody. This does not mean that middle comedy lost all political and ideological factor. It all means that comedy was first and foremost concerned about being understood and about being exportable, about being able to be staged not only in Athens but anywhere in the Greek-speaking world. I mentioned before that tragedy did not change as much. In a period of radical political and geopolitical change, comedy was transformed completely, but tragedy remained more or less stable. Why? Because tragedy did not need to change much or at all. It was already exportable by nature. It already dealt with widely known pan-Hellenic myths. Everybody knew about Agamemnon or Hector or Odysseus or any other epic and tragic character. Whether you watched a tragic performance in Pontus or in Athens or in Sicily, you were already familiar with those myths. Tragedy was already an exportable product. On the contrary, already in the 5th century, it was understood that topical and political comedy was more at home at the Linnea festival rather than at the great Dionysia. What was the difference between those two festivals? The difference was that the Linnea was a winter festival, whereas the great Dionysia was a spring festival. During the winter, the nautical routes were closed, whereas they opened in spring. And if the nautical routes were closed, that meant that the Linnea festival was attended exclusively by citizens of Attica, whereas the great Dionysia had an international audience, as it were. The Linnaean comedies of Aristophanes were topical and political. They mentioned people and situations from the Athenian politics of the day. Whereas the comedies that we know Aristophanes produced at the great Dionysia, clouds, peas, birds, frogs, perhaps the Thesmophoria Zeus too, did not have the overtly Athenocentric character of his Linnaean comedies, but could notionally address a pan-Hellenic audience, as was, I repeat, the audience of that festival held in spring. Let me give you an example. Aristophanes' Acanians was a Linnaean play, whereas Aristophanes' Peace was a Dionysiac play. The two plays practically shared the same theme, the same central topic, that is war and the need for war to stop immediately because it destroys lives, and mostly the lives of common folk. Now, in Peace, a Dionysiac play which was presented to a pan-Hellenic audience, Trigeus's antagonist is the personified war, not a contemporary Athenian figure like the Lamachus of Acarnanians, because the Lamachus of Acarnanians, a contemporary Athenian, would not necessarily be known to a man coming from Macedonia or from Sicily or from Cyprus or from Rhodes or from Asia Minor, whereas everybody could understand war as the antagonist. And let me finish by asking one final question. Is there really such a thing as middle comedy? That may seem like a strange question after all that I said, but there are indeed some scholars, or there have been some scholars, that doubted whether the term middle comedy actually refers to a distinct phase in the evolution of the comic genre, or whether it refers to a transitional period which mixes up elements from the times of Aristophanes on the one hand and Menander on the other. The question cannot easily be resolved, but in my view it is a moot question. It is a matter of ideological rather than substantial nature. The period or the transitional stage of middle comedy is, as noted by a peripatetic treatise called the Tractatus Coeslenianus, amphoin memigmene, mixing elements from both old comedy and new. Whether we call it a period of a transitional stage of comedy, or whether we call it a distinct genre, it doesn't really matter, because any periodization of any phenomenon is conventional and largely heuristic. And middle comedy, real or not, a genre or a phase, is good to think with. And why is it good to think with? Because it helps us conceive of an evolutionary process and ponder the nature of a daring and protean theatrical genre. It helps us understand que pasó. It helps us understand what happened between Aristophanes and Menander. It helps us understand how, and more importantly, why comedy changed so much in this period of time. And that's all from me tonight. Thank you for your patience.
It's also thank you, Professor, for your amazing presentation. It was an enormous pleasure to have this view of the entire transition from old comedy to new comedy. I have a few questions, and everyone here who also want to make a question for the professor, you can turn your camera and make it, or if you want, you can write it here on the chat, and I'll read it for him. But okay, first things first, I want to make a question. From the start of the presentation, you talked on how Aristophanes, he was not only unrealistic but anti-realistic in a sense. And I wanted to ask you to expand on the meaning of this anti-realism for Aristophanes, of your understanding of this anti-realism, and if possible on the difference between this anti-realism of Aristophanes and the realism of Menander, your understanding.
Yeah. Well, this distinction simply means that the non-realistic character of Aristophanes' comedy is not just an accident, but it is a strategy. Aristophanes makes every effort to disrupt reality and even turn it on its head. It presents a fairy tale utopia in which all laws of everyday life are topsy-turvy. It presents a world which the good folk are rewarded and the evil folk are punished. It presents a world in which the little people prevail over the rich and the famous. It presents a world in which a simple individual can design a way out of his problems by himself and get away with it. It presents a strategically reversed, a strategically overturned reality, an anti-reality. On the other hand, Menander makes every effort to present a more or less naturalistic depiction of everyday life. Of course, in Menander's case too, realism is undermined by various features of the genre. First and foremost, Menander's comedy, at the end of the day, is just as utopian, although it does not appear so at first sight. Why is it utopian? Because at the end of every Menandrian play, the boy marries the girl no matter the obstacles. And sometimes these obstacles are not simply misunderstandings or erroneous, unlucky choices by the characters, but they are they are social obstacles produced by civic ideology. For example, the fact that in some new comedy play or other, the reason that a boy cannot marry the girl in some new comedy plays is that the girl is not an Athenian. At the end of that play, the girl will be discovered to be an Athenian. What happens here? What happens is that comic and historical reality are brought to converge. There is a design that naturalizes civic ideology, that presents what is a social construct, and that social construct is the need for both the boy and the girl to be Athenian, to be citizens. That social contract is presented to be a natural law, and that is just as anti-realistic at the end of the day as many of Aristophanes' utopias. I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, you did. It was a great explanation of the concept.
So what you see here is an apparent gap that seems unbridgeable between Aristophanes and Menander in terms of the way they handle realism. But if you look underneath the surface of Menandrian comedy, you do discover an anti-realistic strategy that is not altogether dissimilar to Aristophanes'.
Thank you. It's a great way of seeing it as more connections than I would that it's easily perceivable between the two. Very great presentation. Thank you. It opens another question for me. Something that you talked about during your presentation was on the philosophical influences on Menander, on new comedy. And this is something I would like to ask, if this is maybe another reason for the differences between the two, between old comedy and new comedy. How philosophy, the developments of philosophy of Aristotle impacted comedy and changed it in a way, if this is a possible cause for the differences between the 2 points.
Well, it's one cause for certain. It's not the only cause. It's not the major cause, because as I mentioned, the developments were gradual, and many of the features of Menandrian comedy were already at play decades before Menander, but it is undeniably a major cause. Let me talk a little bit about Menander and philosophy, and peripatetic philosophy particularly. First and foremost, peripatetic philosophy is a unique branch because peripatetic philosophy is both prescriptive and descriptive. What Aristotle and his followers do is a mixture of describing everyday practices and prescribing them. So, especially in the moral branch of peripatetic philosophy, Aristotle is both observing what happens in society around him and describing moral types that he sees on Athens' streets, and prescribing ways that people should behave. So, we do not need necessarily to presume that in the process of writing, of composing his comedies, Menander held a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics and was designing his characters accordingly, because the Nicomachean Ethics was both, again, a prescription and a description of the way people acted and thought. But the convergences between Menander's plays and Aristotle's philosophy, or to put it differently, the utility of Aristotle for explaining Menander, for understanding Menander, is so great, it's so obvious, that it would be entirely counterintuitive to deny the importance of Aristotle for both the composition and the reception of the plays of Menander. Menander was the contemporary of Theophrastus. Biographical tradition, which is not entirely dependable, but it was not entirely fictitious either, makes Menander Theophrastus's pupil. Menander is also made to be another philosopher's acquaintance, namely Epicurus. Menander lived and acted in the same cultural context as these great men. And Athens was nothing like New York or Beijing or Rio or another city of millions. It was a city of around 30 to 40,000 citizens. So the contact and the osmosis between these great minds was practically an everyday situation. And I repeat, it is counterintuitive to assume that there was no spiritual communication between them. So definitely Aristotle's comedy played a major role in determining the character of Menandrian comedy. But the development of the comic genre predated even Aristotle. The comic genre started to change already in Aristophanes' time. The type of comedy that Aristophanes writes after the end of the Archidamian War, after 421, is quite different than the comedy he writes before that period of time, that point of time. Aristophanes created comedies that were quite distinct from one another, and Aristophanes' last two surviving plays, the Ecclesiazuse and the Plutos, are typically considered middle comedy plays. If we want to stick to conventional dating, the Ecclesiazuse of 392 and the Plutos of 388 belong to the period of middle comedy.
Thank you, Professor. You greatly responded my question, and thank you very much. And I fully agree. And we have a question from Philippe Gall right now. he's saying, "Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. I learned a lot. I have two questions. First, do you think that the fact that Euripides had such a close relationship with comedy, maybe even some kind of rivalry with Aristophanes, helped with the transformation of the genre, since Menander was so influenced by Euripides? And second, is it possible to study new comedy without considering the Romance?"
Both very perceptive questions. Let's start with the relationship between Euripides and comedy in Euripides' own time. There seems to have been a mutual relationship between Euripides and comedy. It is obvious that comedy rivaled tragedy in the 5th century. Tragedy was the royal genre, as it were. It was the artistic standard of the day. And in Aristophanes' Acanians, the poet's mouthpiece, the Dikaiopoulos, makes a claim that comedy too, this is his exact words, comedy too can instruct the polis. This is a very important formulation because it reveals comedy's aspiration to be the equal of tragedy, comedy's aspiration to stand on the same level as tragedy. One of the many ways in which comedy rivaled tragedy was para-tragedy. Para-tragedy was the phenomenon according to which comedy parodied the tragic genre. And by parodying the tragic genre, it started gradually to appropriate elements of the tragic genre. That's quite obvious. Everyone who reads Aristophanes or who has ever seen an Aristophanes play on stage has picked on the rivalry between comedy and tragedy, and on the practice of para-tragedy, and on the practice of comedy appropriating elements of tragedy. But research has also shown that it is quite possible that Euripides too, on his part, was keen on appropriating elements of comedy and inserting them into his own plays. Plays like the Bacchae, a late Euripidean play, a non-funny play at all, one of the most horrifying tragedies of Euripides, does present comic elements. So there is osmosis between tragedy and comedy already from the 5th century. And there was mythological and tragic parody to occur already from the 5th century. But when this mythological parody becomes the comic norm in the first half of the 4th century, we already have in front of us a comic tragic hybrid. So certainly this hybridization of comedy and tragedy, which was already underway from the 5th century, was the prime channel through which the tragic stream flowed into the comic one. It is absolutely important to underline Felipe's point that the relationship between comedy and tragedy was not one way. It was a two-way street. And when we reach Menander, we have in front of us a type of comedy that has so absorbed the conventions of tragedy that these conventions are no longer need to become obvious. Menander no longer feels the need, apart from very specific situations, he no longer feels the need to underline the fact that he is now parodying tragedy. He's not even parodying tragedy. He is not trying to send tragedy off. Tragedy is part of the comic genre. So, turning now to Felipe's second question, no, it is not possible fully to study new comedy as a complete historical phenomenon without considering the Romans. On the other hand, the Roman Paliada flourishes and develops in a different kind of context. And whereas the Roman Paliada needs, and the students of the Roman Paliada needs to have the Greek new comedy in mind, the Greek new comedy can indeed be studied independently. And fortunately, after the rediscovery of Menander, we do possess a body of text that allows for the autonomous study of Greek new comedy. Before the late 5th century, the Romans were our main source for Greek new comedy too. And that was an unfortunate reality for Roman comedy as well, because Roman comedy and the study of Roman comedy became subservient to the study of Greek new comedy. The Romans were used only as a medium, as a tool for trying to recapture what was lost of the Greeks, who were considered to be the models, the great exponents of new comedy, the most important playwrights. After the rediscovery of Menander, there was gradually a liberation of such a great comic figure as Plautus. Plautus has nothing to aspire to in comparison to Menander. He is just as great a playwright as Menander, and he can and should be studied in his own right. Roman new comedy needs to be studied in its own context. Roman new comedy can be studied as the adaptation of Greek models. It can be studied for the information we can glean from it regarding its Greek models, but it can and it should be studied also as an autonomous genre, catering to the needs of a different audience in different times. So to try to synopsize my answer, to answer briefly, the study of new comedy without considering the Romans is possible. It is possible to study the Greeks without the Romans nowadays, because we do have complete or almost complete plays of Menander. And it is also to study the Romans without the Greeks, because now we have managed to liberate the Roman Paliada from the need for it to be used exclusively as a kind of a mine from which we can extract information about the regrettably lost models. I don't know if Felipe is satisfied.
He is. He just wrote. He's thanking you very much for your generous answers. Very much indeed. He just wrote. And I'm thankful as well that you touched on Plautus, because we read Plautus too, just after we read Menander. We read Trinumos from him, and this is something I would like to ask you, because you touched on the subject. How do you perceive, when reading Roman comedy, ways to differ from when it's Plautus saying, when it's the voice of the Roman comedian, and when it's the voice of the new comedians from Greece?
Well, Plautus writes in the context of a distinct theatrical tradition that merges three kinds of elements. It first and foremost is the literary element, and that is the element that derives from the fact that Plotus's plays, or most of his plays, are not strictly speaking original creations, but they are the adaptations of Greek plays. The second context is the native Italian theatrical tradition. And this is just as important context as the literary tradition of the Greeks. Plotus himself was an actor, and he was an actor of the kind of Italian mime that prevailed in the day, alongside the fabulae palliatae. And Plotus utilizes the Italian native theatrical tradition in order to create an original hybrid of the two. And this hybridization of the Italian native theatrical tradition with the literary tradition of the Greeks creates an original kind of play that is presented by Plotus to an audience that does not necessarily know Greek. And this is the third aspect that we need to consider. Plotus's audiences were not necessarily elite audiences. Unlike, and that is an assumption, but it is a likely one, unlike the audiences of the other great Roman playwright, Terence. And this is the third context that I like briefly to explore. I mentioned three contexts before: the Greek literary context, the native Italian theatrical tradition, and the third context is assembled if one considers the difference between Plotus's and Terence's types, Plotus's and Terence's audiences. Terence's comedy looks like Menander's to a much greater extent than Plotus. Plotus deviates from Menander enormously. First and foremost, Plotus writes a musical kind of comedy. If you remember what I said before, the musical element is marginalized by Menander. It is very slim in Greek New Comedy, whereas in Plotus's Palliata, it is primary. The cantiga of Plotus and the scenes that are staged with musical accompaniments or rhythmic accompaniments take up most of the performance's time. Terence writes a different kind of comedy, a more literal rendition of the Greek originals, whose originality lies in the fact that he mixes up plot elements from different plays. He performs what he calls contaminatio. He takes one Menanderian play and he inserts into it plot elements from a different play. But the outlook of Terence's comedy is approximates the outlook of Menander's comedy quite a bit. And that happens because Terence mostly addresses the kind of audience that knows Greek, has probably read Menander in the original, and appreciates not the necessarily the reshuffling of the elements of Greek New Comedy, but the more literal rendition of it.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's something it was a great explanation, and this was something that we discussed a lot here. One of our members, Julia, she had to leave us earlier today, but she thanked me a lot. She said that the presentation was amazing and that your video should be, this presentation should be obligatory to everyone who wants to learn more on, on Greek comedy. And she always said that when reading Plautus, she was always bothered by this question of how to make a difference between what is the influence of the comedy and what is him. And I think your answer greatly explained ways to perceive the difference. Thank you.
Well, Plautus is mostly as time goes by, we are more and more convinced that Plautus composed much that was original in his place. There are even hypotheses nowadays that propose the idea that some of Plautus' plays were even original creations in their own right. They weren't even based on Greek originals. We will never know that unless we discovered some external information, but it is quite likely. And even if Plautus works on the basis of a Greek original, it makes a complete mess out of it. Not in a negative way, but in a very positive one.
Thank you. I have some questions also, but first of all, I want to know if it's okay if we're not taking your time too much.
No, I'm at your disposal. Yeah.
Okay. Besides the Romans, you touched on the subject of the Hellenistic poetry and their influence, and I wanted you to expand on this, if you could comment more on how new comedy, middle and new comedy influenced on the changes in poetry during that time as well, and maybe if there was a correlation between both, and the factors that you said that brought change to comedy during that time, if it also influenced poetry as well.
Yeah. What seems to be in effect here is that we, by the end of the 4th century, we have reached a time in which literacy has become a widespread phenomenon. People can read and write. The majority of people can read and write. Libraries have started cropping up all around. Even private libraries have started cropping up all around. The great philosophical schools of Athens had libraries of their own, and quite rich ones as well. Aristotle, to mention the great man once again, was nicknamed the Anagnostes, the reader, because he was a man who dabbled in reading quite a lot. And reading was something, and the book trade was something that revolutionized the way literature was both practiced and received. By the end of the 3rd century and moving on to the 3rd century, when the great library of Alexandria was also set up, we are reaching a point in which literary practitioners feel as if what was worthy of being said had already been said by the ancients, and the task of a literary person now was to devise ways of revisiting the old themes in novel ways. What I described just now is nothing less than the practice of a conscious intertextual stripe of literature, of a literature that knows that it cannot but step on the shoulders of giants, and that counts its own originality not in terms of inventing new themes, but in terms of reworking old texts. It counts its own originality in terms of its cleverness, and it wants to show its cleverness. It wants to advertise the fact that it knows the ancient texts, that it is reworking the ancient texts, that it is taking the ancient words and it is twisting them in novel and in inventive ways. This is what Menander does. What Menander does with Euripides. He takes Euripides for granted, not only as a distant theatrical memory or a closer theatrical memory, because Euripides kept being performed in Menander's time, but he also takes him for granted as a text. We are now talking about a different textualized environment. This is the correlation between the Athenian 4th century and the Hellenistic periods. We are talking about a period of time in which tradition, literary tradition, is a written tradition. It is a book tradition. People have, even normal people have access to libraries, they have access to books, and they have a bookish reception of literature, including dramatic literature. They do not only watch plays performed on stage, but they read them also as books.
Thank you very much, Professor. This shows up so much light, not only on Menander, but on many other Hellenistic poets and writers. Callimachus comes to mind to me. He's absolutely. And coming back to Menander, one question I want to make to you: what do you perceive as? Because we during this presentation we have seen a lot of ways how Menander received from other writers, from other playwrights from the time, from the Middle Comedy. But I wanted to ask you, what do you perceive as factors where Menander rise up above the other writers from the time, from what differentiates him from the Middle Comedicians and New Comedicians as well? For why? Because there's always this big question when reading Menander, at least, that is, why the Romans loved him so much? Yeah. So much, and because of that, I want to ask you, what do you perceive as reasons for this differentiation, for this different treatment that he received to antiquity and even for modern eyes in general?
I can answer this question in two ways. The first is to speculate, and the other is to draw information from ancient judgments on Menander. The need to speculate obviously stems from the fact that no other Greek new comedy playwright is extant. The only exponent of new comedy for us is Menander. His great rivals, Philemon and Diphilus, only survive in fragments. So we cannot directly compare the two, but based on ancient judgments that persisted through the centuries, 4, 5, even 6 or 7 centuries after Menander's death, we can safely say that the ancients considered Menander to be one of the following things. He was first and foremost a great sculptor of characters. He created memorable individuals. He took what was basically cardboard, stereotypical characters and turned them into flesh and blood people that to whom one could relate. And this is a great achievement if one is working within such a limiting genre as New Comedy was. Menander was also a great stylist, although he wrote in a language that was not as fanciful and as literary as Aristophanes is. He created a linguistic medium that could recreate on stage the way real people talked. He could show sentiments, true sentiments, by way of his words. He could make his people look alive by the very way they talked. Menander was admired in antiquity also for his inventiveness in plot construction, and that was not a mean feat. It was in fact a great feat to manage to be inventive again with within such a delimiting genre, to find minor twists that could produce novel and interesting variations of an otherwise formulaic plot type. These judgments are repeated time and again by ancient writers from the 3rd century BC to the end of late antiquity. Menander was studied by rhetoricians in Greece and in Rome for the quality of his written words, for the quality of his characters' speeches. He was considered essential reading, in fact, for the training of any aspiring orator. No aspiring orator could do without studying Menander in depth. Menander was still being performed in the 4th, even in the 5th, and in the 6th century AD, whereas we do not hear of performances of Philemon or Diphilus or Philippides or Apollodorus of Charistus. Menander was the playwright that was mostly adapted by the Romans. All this cumulative evidence should be enough proof that at least in the according to the subjective criteria of the ancients, Menander was considered to be the great new comedy playwright. And Menander was not even only considered to be the great man of new comedy, he was considered to be the equal of Euripides and second only to Homer. And that's a great praise indeed. The equal of Euripides and second only to Homer.
Thank you, Professor. It was great elucidating as well on this question. I want to one thing that you touches in your book on what's the name exactly? Menander, New Comedy and the Visual. One thing that you touch here that I want to see you, because you presented the images of the masks and the statues, and you touch on the science of physiognomics in the book, and I wonder if you could explain more how this was developed by Menander for us here.
Yeah, let's start by repeating what physiognomics is. Physiognomics is more of a practice than a science, but it was a practice that started to percolate into scientific discourse already from the end of the 5th century. Medical doctors, philosophers, and rhetoricians started using or started formulating physiognomic theories, according to which the external features of a face or a body were not just external features. They were the tickets for entering the internal world of that person. For instance, the way a nose is shaped, or a mouth is shaped, or a forehead is shaped, the color of the hair, the puffiness or non-puffiness of the cheeks, the color of the skin, were not innocent body elements, but they were signs. They were signs of internal of the internal composition of the person. They were signs of a person's soul, as it were. Now, in 4th century sculpture, these theories started taking visual shape. Sculptors like Lysippus did not want just to present beautiful individuals. They wanted to present individuals with depth. And we do have evidence that Lysippus especially was well versed in physiognomic theories. Moving on to the masks now. The way authors like Pollux describe the masks of New Comedy shows convergences with the way physiognomic treatises like Pseudo-Aristotle's Physiognomica talk about those very features that Pollux singles out on particular masks. There seems to be a dialogue between physiognomic theory, sculpture, and mask making in this period of time. That is one thing. The second thing is that physiognomics is also more or less of a natural reaction. We have all caught ourselves making assumptions about people based on their external appearances. And if you remember the Dyskolos, there is a point in the beginning of the play when Gorgias first catches sight of Sostratos, and he reacts negatively to the man just by virtue of his external appearance. I see him. This is what who you are talking about. He looks like a villain simply by virtue of his face. This is nothing else than physiognomizing a person. So we are within a culture that is not only naturally inclined, but also theoretically informed about physiognomics, about using a person's external appearance as a means to internalize this appearance, as a means to entering this person's soul. And a genre that's so interested in character could not be uninterested in these visual dynamics as well. And a genre in which the mask is so central, as is the comic genre, could not but take both an interest and it could not but take an interest in ways in which the mask could be used as an extra way of constructing character on stage and in the real time of performance. This is a complicated issue that needs quite a bit of explaining, but I hope that I gave you an outline.
Definitely you did, Professor. Thank you again. Ask if anyone else want to make a question, please do it now. If no, send me now, or if no, I will make a final question to wrap it all up. I want to ask you, what do you believe is are the biggest challenges for the scholar of Menander, of new and middle comedy? What do you think are the challenges for one who wants to get in depth on this study. And if you have any recommendations of readings for one who wants to enter into it.
I will disclose my greatest fear. I am now working on a new edition and commentary of Menander's Discourse that will come out will be published by Oxford University Press in the next couple of years, hopefully. My greatest fear and hope in the same time is that a new piece of Menandrian play will come to light. In fact, 20 years ago, in 2003, there was a surprising announcement. And that announcement said that underneath the exterior writing of a Vatican palimpsest, there was not one but two Menandrian plays, one of which was totally unknown to us before, and the second was the Discourse. Who knows if those 200 lines of the Discourse lying underneath the Vatican palimpsest reveal elements of Menander's play that we didn't know before. Well, it's not going to reveal anything new because the Discourse survives complete, but it may contain different readings of lines. It may come from a different branch of the manuscript tradition of the Discourse. The greatest challenge and the greatest hope for a Menandrian scholar today is that the new discoveries have not ended, and that new Menandrian plays will come to light, or even plays by other new comedy playwrights that are nowadays unknown, or plays or parts of plays, chunks of plays from middle comedy playwrights, the greats like Alexis or Antiphanes or Eubulus, that will enrich and complicate our understanding of the genre. And if this happens at the expense of our books, let it be so. If we end up like the great Tom Webster, who tried to divine the plot of the Discourse a few years before the play's discovery, only to be proven almost completely wrong, let it be so. Let it be so.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. If you have any recommendations for us, or a good introduction to the subject, for the ones here who...
Well, I'm not one to give you any advice, but I do commend you. I'm not recommending anything, but I do commend you. I do commend you for setting up this club and for delving into the great texts of classical antiquity. I also thank you for having me tonight and for giving me the opportunity to travel to Brazil for the first time in my life, albeit via Google Meets and YouTube. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
I am the one who thank you, Professor. It was an enormous pleasure. I think I talk for everyone here that it was a marvelous presentation. Penelope Steradi here from YouTube is sending you congratulations and saying that it was an extremely illuminating presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we'll end here our recording.